Welcome to the Brown University Library for today's Ungerleider Symposium, a scholarly celebration of the recent gift of a sizable collection of Passover Haggadot from Dr. Stephen Ungerleider. Donated in honor of Dr. Ungerleider's father, Samuel Ungerleider Jr., Brown class of 1939, the Dr. Stephen Ungerleider Collection of Haggadot is remarkable for its geographic breadth, spanning most of the globe and documenting a wide variety of Jewish ritual experiences across the diaspora. In this short video, we present a selection of some of the treasures in the collection.
Liber Rituum Paschalium. The Haggadah could also serve as a bridge of knowledge between Jewish and Christian society. In the 16th to 18th centuries, some Christian scholars were searching for the source of divine knowledge in the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition. They were known as Christian Hebraists. Among them was Johann Stephan Rittangel, a professor of Oriental languages in Königsberg, East Prussia. In 1644, he translated the Haggadah into Latin and German and published it together with the Hebrew in a book called in Latin Liber Rituum Paschalium, the Book of the Paschal Rites, and in Hebrew Seder Haggadah Shel Pesach, the Order of the Passover Haggadah. He was an eccentric figure who, among other things, grew a long beard and adopted Jewish dress. This so confused his contemporaries that they thought he might actually be a convert from Judaism. In fact, that possibility cannot be entirely ruled out. He certainly demonstrated a detailed knowledge of how German Jews celebrated the Seder in the 17th century. One of the most remarkable aspects of his Haggadah is that he also published the musical notation of two of the songs sung around the Seder table. This must have fascinated his Christian contemporaries and, when reconstructed, also allows us to experience at least some of the joy of the Seder as it was celebrated in Europe more than 350 years ago.
My two favorite volumes from the Ungerleider are a Haggadah from Amsterdam, printed in 1695, and a Haggadah from Aleppo, printed in 1887. The Amsterdam Haggadah includes a fold-out woodcut engraving of Israel. I love this illustration because of its intricacies. When you look closely, you can see the unique design of the landscape and the repetition of certain features in the waterways, the hills, the desert. The place names are particularly striking to me. Unlike other maps where names have been changed over time for various reasons, colonization, recategorization of countries, changes in borders, these names, the Great Sea, the Dead Sea, the Negev, have persisted across time. Despite the fraught legacy of this land and the state of Israel, the land retains a sense of history just in naming. The Aleppo Haggadah of 1887 is another favorite of mine. Beyond being exceedingly rare and very delicately designed, I think its original location speaks to this idea of thinking of Jews beyond temporal and spatial bounds. Syria is a neighbor of Israel, but for Jews in the United States, the Syrian civil war and the refugee crisis can feel very far away. Without intending to sound simplistic or pedantic, this Haggadah reminds me of the overlapping shared sacred spaces Jews inhabited over time. Even beyond the spatial tie to Syria, Aleppo signifies crisis in many of our minds these days. This connection only reinforces the cruciality of Jews fighting for justice and relief of ongoing refugee crisis and violation of human rights, regardless of our own affiliation with that land. As ever, the beauty of Haggadot, of observing Shabbat on Friday nights, of celebrating our holidays and practicing our Jewish rituals, reminds us that regardless of spatial and temporal bounds, you can imagine a Jewish community across the world observing and celebrating the same values, the same histories. These Haggadot are a manifestation, the materiality of our tradition brought in conjunction with one another from the 1550s to the 1950s, from communist Haggadot to provocative, resistant Haggadot, to the history of printing in Amsterdam, to Jewish communities in India. This collection signifies to us what so many Jews value about our ritualistic endeavors, that next year in Jerusalem, next year we will all be together in the Holy Land. And for now, this year, we are left feeling secure and stable in the idea that on Passover, on Shabbat, we are all observing the same histories and repeating the same traditions for generations to come.
This compendium of prayers and Haggadah was the first Hebrew book printed in the Comte de Venaissin, the former papal state surrounding the city of Avignon, roughly equivalent to the present Département de Vaucluse, comprising the Jewish communities of Avignon, Carpentras, Cavaillon, and Les Îles-sur-le-Sorgue, along with several smaller Jewish settlements in Provence that date back to the 13th century. Avignon had previously lacked a Hebrew press, and it was only the second city in France to receive one. Jews in the Comte de Venaissin were under the protection of the Pope, and accordingly had freedom to develop their own unique liturgy. Before the appearance of this volume, Jews of the Comte de Venaissin relied on manuscript versions of their liturgy, which they recorded in a language adapted from Hebrew and the local Provençal, often called Judeo-Provençal, which is represented in this volume. The compiler of the volume, Mardochée or Mordechai Ventur, was a local scholar who composed his own liturgical songs, some of which he included here. He was also known for his translations of Jewish liturgy from Hebrew into French, some of which were later utilized by the Sephardic community in Bordeaux in the creation of their own French-language Haggadah in 1844. This London Haggadah was produced by Alexander Abraham Alexander and his son Levi in 1806. Though he is not well remembered today, in 1785 Alexander Abraham Alexander had created the first Hebrew-English Pentateuch produced by a Jewish scholar in England, so he was evidently quite well educated and knowledgeable. A significant feature of this Haggadah, and the principal reason that I am drawn to it, is the wonderful series of maps that Alexander created, not just to show the Holy Land, for this had already been done in the Amsterdam Haggadah of 1695, but to trace the route of the Israelites after leaving Egypt and their wanderings in the desert before they reached the Promised Land. These maps represent a wonderful piece of additional scholarship that expanded on the story of the Exodus in both a visual and a historical sense. Isaac Judah Eberst came from a musical family in Offenbach, but trained as a bookbinder before abandoning the trade to become an itinerant musician. He adopted the name of his hometown as a surname, married, and then, in 1816, settled his family in Cologne, where he not only served the synagogue as cantor, but also gave music lessons and composed music, both religious and secular. This 1838 Haggadah, to which he contributed, shows some early influences of the Reform movement then active in Germany. Here, Offenbach rendered the traditional Aramaic song Haggadah into the German Ein Lämmchen, and also added what were described as some newly composed melodies of his own. His gifts for music were passed along to his younger son, the opera composer Jacques Offenbach. The Ungerleider collection includes a number of representative Haggadot from India, which were previously little known in the West. This Bombay Haggadot was the very first illustrated Haggadah produced in India. It was produced for use of the Bene Israel community in the Indian states of Maharashtra and Gujarat. But it also represents a cultural turning of the ancient Bene Israel community traditions toward normative Jewish practices under the influence of the Jewish community at Cochin, further south in Kerala state. Here, the influence of the Cochin community is shown in the Marathi translation of the text that was prepared by the Cochin scholar Chaim Joseph Kalagua. The images were copied from the Amsterdam Haggadah of 1695, which was widely influential across the Jewish diaspora well into the 20th century. This Bombay Haggadah was also the very first to include translation from Hebrew into a local vernacular Indian language. Often neglected in the study of Jewish history and culture are Jewish groups that are not associated with either of the two main strands of the European Jewish experience, the Sephardi or Spanish, and the Ashkenazi or German Jews. This manuscript Haggadah represents one such tradition, that of the Jews of Kurdistan, whose Aramaic-speaking communities once spanned the Near East from Syria to present-day Iran. Kurdish Jewry has an ancient lineage, dating back to the 8th century BCE. By the Middle Ages, the European travelers Benjamin of Tudela and Petachia of Regensburg recorded that the Jewish population of Kurdistan was substantial, comprising 100 settlements. Of particular note was the Jewish community in the city of Mosul, Kurdistan's spiritual heart and commercial center. Jewish culture continued to thrive under the Ottoman Empire at the time that Rabbi Shalom Gabi created this manuscript in Mosul to record for posterity the laws, customs, and local liturgical hymns of its Passover celebrations. Most of the Jews of Kurdistan emigrated to Israel in the 1950s, and very few remain in Mosul today. Rabbi Gabi's manuscript thus provides one of the few surviving records of their culture. Some of the most beautiful and elegant Haggadot, both in manuscript and printed form, have been created by professional artists on commission for wealthy patrons. Such is the case with the Offenbacher Haggadah of 1927, named for the town in which it was created. The patron for this commission was the well-to-do Offenbach lawyer Siegfried Guggenheim, who valued fine art and Jewish culture in equal measure. For this work, he engaged a celebrated type designer, Rudolf Koch, a follower of William Morris and the arts and crafts movement, along with the graphic designer Fritz Kradel, to create a new edition of the Haggadah which incorporated modernist tropes. Guggenheim himself took on the role of publisher for this enterprise. Although Guggenheim continued to play an important role in Jewish communal life throughout the 1930s, with the rise of the Nazi Party, his public role diminished and his welfare was threatened. In 1938, his license to practice law was revoked, and, after a month's internment in Buchenwald, he was released on the condition that he leave Germany. Guggenheim and his wife would spend the rest of their lives in the United States. One of the more interesting aspects of the Ungerleider collection are the Haggadot showing how wartime experiences of Jews influenced the ritual experience of Passover. This remarkable Haggadah from 1946, known as the Survivor's Haggadah, reflects the trials endured by Jews during the Second World War. Its author was Yosef Dov Scheinson, a Hebrew teacher from Kovno, Lithuania, who had survived 4 years of internment at Theresienstadt and several slave labor camps. By 1946, Scheinson was living in Munich, where he worked on a Jewish newspaper while composing the Haggadah, in which he intertwined the ancient telling of the liberation from slavery in Egypt under the pharaohs with the recent history of those who had survived the Nazi genocide. Stark woodcuts by another survivor, the Hungarian artist Miklós Adler, evoke the traditional tale of oppression and liberation in contemporary terms. It was not long before Rabbi Abraham Klausner, a chaplain assigned to the U.S. Third Army, discovered this Haggadah and initiated this new printing of it under the auspices of the U.S. government, so that he could use it for a Seder he held for American relief workers and Jewish displaced persons in Munich during Passover 1946. We hope you've enjoyed this short presentation. These Haggadot are just a selection of the many items in the Dr. Stephen Ungerleider Collection of Haggadot, which is available for all researchers to use, both online and in person, in the Special Collections Reading Room at the John Hay Library. For further information, please email hay@brown.edu.